The man was rubbing a boot with a bone. Not polishing it, not buffing it, rubbing it slow, deliberate circles, the knuckle of a cattle bone pressed into the toe cap with the kind of pressure that would leave bruises on anything softer than leather. It was 4:47 in the morning. The workshop smelled of tallow and turpentine and something older than both. A single bulb hung over the workbench. Outside, Horse Guard's parade was dark and wet and completely empty. Daniel Rowe stood in the doorway with his phone in his hand and his stopwatch running. He had been standing there for 11 minutes. He had not been acknowledged. That, he said finally, cannot possibly be necessary. The man with the bone didn't look up. No, he said, it isn't necessary, it's required. Rowe typed something into his phone. He had been typing things into his phone since he arrived at the barracks 3 days ago. He had a report to finish. The report had a title, Optimization of Ceremonial Kit Procurement and Preparation, Phase 2 Review, and the report had a conclusion that had been written before the report had been started, which was the normal way these things worked. The conclusion was that the ministry could save £2.3 million annually by outsourcing ceremonial kit preparation, including boots, to a contracted supplier in the Midlands who had already submitted a very competitive tender. The man with the bone was Sergeant Malcolm Hare. He was 51 years old. He had 22 years in the household cavalry, and he had been preparing boots in this workshop for 16 of them. His hands looked like the leather he worked creased in the same places, dark in the same places, worn smooth where they gripped things the most. He did not look like a man who read ministry reports. He looked like a man who knew exactly what was in them. The workshop sat beneath the eastern end of Horse Guards, accessed by a stairwell that smelled of damp stone and old oil, and that nobody used who didn't need to. It was not a large room. 6 workbenches arranged in 2 rows. Boot trees stacked along the far wall like soldiers at attention. Tins of dubbin and wax and bone grease arranged with the kind of precision that suggested a man who had lost things before and didn't intend to again. 3 other men worked at the benches. They were younger, 2 of them were troopers, one a lance corporal named Price who had been in the workshop for 4 years and still hadn't been given the bone. That was not a formal designation. There was no ceremony attached to it. It was simply that Malcolm had not yet handed it to him, and Price understood that this meant something, and so he waited. The youngest one, barely 19, all ears and elbows, name tag reading Ellis, was doing what he had been doing for 2 weeks, sitting at the end bench, watching and occasionally being handed a rag and told to keep rubbing. Ellis had asked on his first day how long it took to prepare a pair of boots. Malcolm had said, "Depends on the boots." Ellis had asked what that meant. Malcolm had said, "Keep rubbing." Rowe had been told by the officer who briefed him that Malcolm Hare was the most experienced bootman in the household cavalry, possibly in the entire mounted division, and that he should be treated with appropriate respect. Rowe had nodded and written subject, Hare, MSGT. Interview scheduled in his phone, and then asked if there was somewhere he could get a decent coffee at this hour. There wasn't. He was now on his 3rd instant from a kettle in the corridor, holding the mug in one hand and his stopwatch in the other, watching a man press a bone into leather in slow circles, and trying to understand what exactly he was watching. "Can I ask," Rowe said, "what that does the bone?" Malcolm set the boot on the tree, picked up the other one, began again. "Closes the grain," he said. "The grain." "Of the leather. Every hide has a grain. Open grain takes in moisture, takes in dirt, lets go of its shape under pressure. You close it," he pressed the bone down, a long smooth stroke from the toe toward the heel, "and it holds." Rowe looked at his stopwatch. "And how long does this stage take?" "As long as it takes." Rowe typed something. Malcolm did not look at him. The boots themselves were not, on first appearance, remarkable objects. They were black. They were tall knee-height, stiffened, with a slight curve built into the shaft that matched the angle of a man's leg in a stirrup. They had a toe cap that caught light the way a still lake catches it, not reflecting exactly, but holding it, pulling it in and keeping it. They had no zips, no Velcro, no modern concession of any kind. They weighed each one, approximately 2 kilograms. They cost in materials and time more than most people's monthly rent. And they were prepared, not manufactured, not assembled, prepared, the way a surgeon prepares a theater or a pilot prepares a plane, over a period of between 6 and 14 weeks, depending on the boot, depending on the rider, depending on what Malcolm's hands told him when he held them. Rowe had looked up the procurement figures on his second day. He had looked at the time allocation logs on his third. He had come down to the workshop at 4:47 in the morning because he wanted to see the hours being spent, and now he was watching them, and they looked to him exactly like what the report said they looked like. "Waste. Walk me through it," Ellis said. It was just before 6. Rowe had retreated to the corridor to make a call. Price and the other trooper were at their benches, working quietly. Malcolm had set down the bone and was holding one boot at arm's length, turning it slowly in the light. Ellis had learned in 2 weeks that this was the moment to ask things. When Malcolm held something up and looked at it, he was in a state between thinking and speaking, and questions could fit into that space if they were asked quietly and without urgency. "Walk you through what?" Malcolm said, still turning the boot. "All of it, the whole thing. Why it takes," Ellis glanced toward the corridor, "why it takes this long." Malcolm looked at the boot for another moment. Then he set it down on the tree and pulled the workbench stool out from under the bench with his foot and sat on it, which was something he almost never did while working. "You know what a cavalry boot is for," he said. Ellis thought this was a test. "Riding," he said. "It's a brace," Malcolm said. "It's a knee brace, an ankle brace, and an emergency release mechanism all in one piece of leather. When a horse goes down, and horses go down, doesn't matter how well trained, something spooks them, they trip, a crowd presses too close, the boot has to release the rider's foot from the stirrup cleanly. Not eventually, immediately." He picked up the boot. You get a foot caught in a stirrup and a 1,000-kilogram animal going sideways at speed. You're not talking about a broken ankle. You're talking about something that ends a life or changes it permanently. Ellis was quiet. "The shape of the toe," Malcolm continued, "is not decorative. It's cut at a specific angle so that under lateral pressure, the kind you get when a horse rolls, the foot pivots out of the stirrup instead of locking into it. If that angle is 2 degrees off, it doesn't release cleanly." He set the boot down. "The stiffness of the shaft is not ceremonial. It's structural. It holds the rider's lower leg against the horse's flank, keeps the knee from twisting. Too soft and the rider's leg moves independently of the horse, which sounds like a small thing until you're at parade pace on cobblestone." He picked up the bone. "And the grain," he said, "is not aesthetic. Closed grain holds the shape of the boot under heat and pressure, and horse leather generates both. Open grain boots stretch. They change shape across a 2-hour parade. By the end, the boot isn't the shape it was at the start, which means the release angle has changed." He looked at Ellis. "Which means the boot that passed inspection at 900 is not the boot the rider is wearing at 1100. The corridor was quiet. "So when someone asks me how long it takes," Malcolm said, picking up the boot and pressing the bone back into the toe cap, "I say, depends on the boot. Because it depends on what the hide is doing and what the shape is doing and whether the grain is closing the way it should. And I can't tell you that from a schedule. I can tell you that from my hands." Ellis looked at the boot. "How do you know when it's done?" he asked. Malcolm ran the bone down the toe cap in one long, even stroke. "It tells you," he said. Rowe came back at 7:30 with a fresh printout and a different expression. He had been on the phone. The call had gone well from his perspective, which meant it had produced clarity in the direction he needed. He set the printout on the edge of Malcolm's bench. Malcolm didn't look at it. The tender has been reviewed at senior level, Rowe said. The contractor has addressed the previous concerns. They've updated their production specifications. The report is going to recommend a phased transition, starting with parade boots, rolling out over 18 months. Malcolm turned the boot on the tree, checked the heel. The previous concerns, he said. Yes. Which concerns are those? Rowe paused. The concerns raised after the 2021 trial period. The workshop had been quiet before. It became a different kind of quiet, the kind that has weight in it. Price at the far bench stopped working. Tell me about the 2021 trial period, Malcolm said. Rowe shifted his weight. There was a trial outsourcing period, 18 months, using the same contractor. It was discontinued. There were some quality issues. Quality issues, Malcolm said. Yes. Trooper was dragged 40 feet across cobblestones on the mall, Malcolm said. His left boot failed to release from the stirrup when his horse went down at the changing of the guard. He was dragged from the arch at Horse Guards to 20 meters past the Household Cavalry Memorial. His left knee was rebuilt over 3 surgeries. He was medically discharged 8 months later. He set the boot down. His name was Corporal James Reeves. He'd been in the regiment for 7 years. He was 29. Rowe said nothing. The incident was logged, Malcolm said, as writer error. He reached under the bench. He pulled out a manila folder, worn at the corners, held closed with a rubber band. He set it on top of Rowe's printout. That's the original maintenance report, Malcolm said, filed the morning after before the recategorization. He tapped the folder once. I kept it. Rowe opened the folder. He read it standing at the bench because there was nowhere to sit and he didn't ask. It took him 4 minutes. His stopwatch was still running in his pocket. He had forgotten about it. The report was 2 pages. It was written in the dense, abbreviated language of military maintenance logs, but it was legible. It described a left parade boot, contractor produced, inspected, and passed at 8:30 on the morning of the incident. It noted the toe cap profile, the sole attachment, the grain treatment. It noted the boot had been in use for 11 weeks. It noted, in a section at the bottom under additional observations, that the toe cap angle measured 3.2 degrees outside the specified tolerance. It noted this had not been flagged at morning inspection because the inspector had used a visual check, not a physical gauge. It noted that at the lateral pressure created by a horse rolling at speed, a toe cap at that angle would not release cleanly from a standard stirrup. It noted that this observation was made post-incident. Rowe closed the folder. He looked at the 2 boots on Malcolm's bench, the ones he had been watching being prepared for the past 3 days. Then he looked up at Malcolm. "Show me the difference," he said. Malcolm reached under the bench again. He brought out a 3rd boot, older, scuffed, the shine long gone from it. A contractor boot from the trial period kept for exactly this purpose. He set it next to the finished boot on the bench. They looked identical. To Rowe's eyes, holding his phone light over them, turning them, pressing the toes, checking the heel, they looked completely, entirely identical. "I can't see it," Rowe said. "No," Malcolm said, "you can't." He reached over and pressed 2 fingers against the toe cap of the contractor boot, just below the highest point of the curve, and pressed. The leather gave slightly, a barely perceptible compression. He did the same to his own boot. The leather did not move. "Feel that," he said. Rowe pressed his fingers where Malcolm's had been, on the contractor boot first, then on Malcolm's. He felt it. The difference was small enough to be argued away in a meeting. It was not small enough to matter when you were on the ground and the horse was moving and your foot needed to come free in the next half second. "How long did it take to get yours to that point?" Rowe asked. He was looking at Malcolm's boot. "This pair," Malcolm said, 7 weeks. Rowe looked at the contractor boot. "Theirs." "Label says 11 days, Malcolm said. The workshop was very quiet. "You can't see it," Malcolm said again, picking up the contractor boot and setting it back under the bench. That's why it takes this long. Not because we're being precious about tradition. Because the thing we're making is the difference between a man walking off a parade ground and a man being carried off it. And the only way to know whether we've got it right is to spend enough time with it that it tells you. Rowe looked at his printout, then at the folder, then at the two men at the far bench who had been listening to every word without appearing to. He picked up the folder. "Can I keep this?" he said. "No," Malcolm said, "but you can photograph every page." Rowe spent 40 minutes photographing the maintenance report. He did it methodically, each page twice, checking the focus each time. He sent the photos to an address that was not in his ministry contact list. Then he sat in the corridor on the stone step with the cold coming up through it and his coffee gone cold in his mug, and he made 2 phone calls. The first call was short, he said. "The data from the 2021 period is compromised. The incident wasn't logged correctly. We need to pull the tender." There was a pause on the other end. Then, "I'll need that in writing," Rowe said. "You'll have it today." The second call was longer and less comfortable. At the end of it, he came back into the workshop and stood at the edge of the room and said, to no one in particular, "The report is being revised." Malcolm was working on the second boot. He didn't look up. Price, at the far bench, allowed himself a very small and very controlled expression that lasted approximately half a second before his face went professional again. Ellis looked at Malcolm, then at Rowe, then back at Malcolm. "When you say revised," Ellis said before he could stop himself. "Ellis," said Price. "The tender is being withdrawn," Rowe said. He sounded like a man who had spent 3 days building something and had just watched it fall over, and was trying to decide whether he was angry or simply tired. "Pending a full review of the 2021 incident log and recategorization." Malcolm turned the boot on the tree. "Reeves," he said. Rowe looked at him, sorry. "James Reeves," Malcolm said, "the trooper. When the review recategorizes the incident, and it will make sure his name is in the file, not writer error, his name." He pressed the bone into the leather. "He deserves that much." Rowe was quiet for a moment. "I'll see to it," he said. He picked up his bag. He paused at the door. He looked at the boots on the trees, the tins on the shelf, the bone in Malcolm's hand, the single bulb overhead. "How many pairs do you do a year?" he asked. "Depends," Malcolm said. Rowe almost smiled. "On the boot." "On the boot," Malcolm agreed. Rowe left. His footsteps went up the stone stairs and faded into the morning. The workshop settled back into itself. Price began working again. The other trooper began working again. Malcolm turned the boot, checked the heel, pressed the bone along the shaft in a long, even stroke. Ellis sat at his bench with a rag in his hand. "He's going to fix it," Ellis said. "The recategorization." "He said he would," Malcolm said. "Do you trust that?" Malcolm considered this. He ran the bone along the toe cap, checking the curve. "He came in here with a conclusion," Malcolm said. "He left without it. That's as much as I can ask." Ellis was quiet for a while. Then, "How long has that maintenance report been under your bench?" 3 years, Malcolm said. "You kept it for 3 years waiting for someone to need it." Malcolm set the boot on the tree and turned it in the light. "I kept it," he said, "because it was true. Whether anyone needed it was their business." He looked at the boot a moment longer. Reeves needed it. Took 3 years for someone to come along who could do something with it. Ellis looked at the rag in his hand. "Were you and Reeves close?" he asked. "He came through this workshop," Malcolm said. 2 years, good hands. He reached for the second boot, learned fast, asked good questions." Ellis looked at the rag, then at his bench. Then he picked up the boot he'd been working on for 2 days and held it up the way he'd seen Malcolm hold things, at arm's length, turning it in the light. He could see at least 4 things wrong with it. He was getting better at seeing them. He set it down and kept working. 6 weeks later, a trooper whose name was not on any ministry report and who had never heard of Daniel Rowe or a tender from the Midlands or a maintenance file that sat under a workbench for 3 years, pulled on a pair of black cavalry boots in a dressing room off the Knightsbridge Barracks at 7:15 on a Tuesday morning. He worked them onto his feet with the practiced ease of a man who had done it 300 times. He stood. He walked the length of the room and back. He pressed his heel down once, testing the fit. They were perfect. He had no idea how long they had taken to make. He was, in the way of all men who wear things made by other men's hands, completely unaware of the weeks of early mornings and single bulbs, and a bone pressed in slow circles into leather that had to be told, not ordered, into the shape that might one day be the difference between walking and being carried. He went out to the yard. His horse was waiting. He mounted with one clean movement, foot going into the stirrup, boot holding the angle exactly as it should, the leather against his leg stiff and certain and carrying, in its grain and its shape and its silence, everything that the man who made it knew about what it meant to trust a thing made properly. The parade began. The boot held. In the workshop below Horse Guards, the morning had moved on. Price was on his 3rd pair of the week. The other trooper was heating dubbin over a small lamp, stirring it with a wooden dowel. Malcolm was at his bench with the bone, beginning a new pair, the leather still raw and unmarked, carrying all its future shape inside it like a held breath. Ellis set down the pair he'd been working on. He walked to the end of Malcolm's bench. He stood there for a moment, not speaking. Malcolm turned the boot. Ellis reached under his own bench and brought out the bone he had been given the previous Tuesday, the first morning after the Rowe incident, handed over without ceremony or comment, just placed on the bench beside his rag while Malcolm was already walking away. He sat down. He positioned the bone against the toe cap. He pressed. He started in slow circles, the way he had watched it done for 6 weeks, and for the first time he felt what Malcolm had described, not the resistance of the leather but the conversation with it, the slight yielding in one place, the firmness in another, the grain beginning to close under the pressure. He kept going. Malcolm at the next bench said nothing. He didn't need to. There is a room beneath Horse Guards Parade in London where men sit under a single bulb at 5 in the morning and press a bone into leather in slow circles. And if you ask them why, they would tell you about grain and angle and release tolerances, and the explanation would sound technical, and it would be technical, and it would also be something else. It would be the knowledge that the man who wears the thing you are making is trusting you with his life in a way he will never know about, will never think about, will never have reason to consider unless the moment comes when the horse goes down, and the foot needs to come free, and either it does or it doesn't. And if you want to know why it takes so long, longer than a rifle to clean, longer than a saddle to fit, longer than almost any other piece of kit in the household cavalry's inventory, that is why. Not tradition, not ceremony, not the performance of care. The real thing. The kind that keeps a man's name out of a file-marked writer error. The kind that a 19-year-old with a rag and a bone is learning right now, at 6 in the morning, in a room that smells of tallow and turpentine, pressing slow circles into leather that isn't finished yet, waiting for it to tell him when it is. If you've ever dismissed something as slow and thought faster would do just as well, drop a comment. Tell us what it was. Tell us whether you were right. Because sometimes the thing that looks like waste is the only thing standing between the way things go and the way they could have gone differently. And the people who know the difference are usually in a basement somewhere, working under a single bulb, long before the rest of the world is awake. Like the video if this one landed. Subscribe, tap the bell. Tomorrow there's another story, the kind that sounds like a small thing until it isn't. Stay sharp, stay patient. And never let anyone time you when the work requires a different kind of clock.